of role of transplant in management of hepatocellular carcinomas. So like the usual format, we will have a lecture followed by a panel discussion. So I invite Dr. Sonal Asthana, who is a transplant surgeon basically in the Aster Hospital. So sir will be delivering a lecture basically on role of transplant in hepatocellular carcinomas, basically overview and indications, and a brief discussion on how to proceed. So sir, I welcome you for the lecture. Please take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Shaleen, Dr. Nikhil, Dr. Shefali, for this very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be giving this talk at this educational symposium. My job is made easier because I know it's followed by a case discussion, which will probably highlight some of the factors which I may not have time to go in detail in this presentation. So the plan today essentially is to talk a little bit about liver transplantation in the context of hepatocellular carcinoma, who can benefit, who does not benefit, and how does one select these patients. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir. Your screen is visible. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So hepatocellular carcinoma is a cause of concern for all of us. It has a rising incidence. It's the 5th commonest cause of death in men in India. Broadly speaking, its incidence parallels the incidence of hepatitis B, and predictably it's higher in the Southeast Asian region of the world, as well as in India. More importantly, in India, we see a lot of HCC linked to NASH, which is a growing concern. This can also happen in non-cirrhotic patients. Now, why should we care? Because while we seem to be winning in most other indications of cancer, we have actually shown a demonstrable decrease in mortality over several years. This is certainly not the case in a few number of cases. For example, lung cancer, esophageal or pancreatic cancer, melanomas, and liver and bile duct cancers, where the mortality has in fact increased over time as compared to the other cancers. What is the cause of hepatocellular carcinoma in India? Again, broadly speaking, in India, the cause is linked to viral disease for the large part, but of course, NASH and alcoholic liver disease are becoming more prominent. Once we jump to the management, because I understand that radiology has been covered already, one must realize that it is in fact not one, but 2 diseases that you're dealing with. As opposed to, say, oncology, where you're dealing with just one tumor occurring in a particular organ. Here, you're not only treating the tumor, but you're also treating liver disease, because the vast majority of patients occur in a damaged liver. Now, this damaged liver can have 2 components. It can have hepatocellular components, where it can have jaundice, ascites, GI bleeds, and so on and so forth. Or it can have a portal hypertensive component, each of which has a negative prognostic implication on the treatment abilities that we can do. When we talk about treatment, we have to think about surgical resection, which is curative, or transplantation, non-surgical ablation, embolization, systemic therapy, etc. And of course, all these treatments, although they may be present, they have to be seen in the context of what is deliverable locally. So broadly speaking, when we look at staging systems, this is probably a slide that you've seen before for HCC management, where we have the Barcelona clinic system, where essentially it combines not just the liver disease or the liver tumor, but also the functional status of the patient. And based on that, certain recommendations are made for treatment, whether curative or palliative. I mean, it's a simpler way of looking at it in a different way. You can have a good tumor occurring in a good liver. You can have a good tumor in a bad liver or a cirrhotic liver. A bad tumor, which would mean, an aggressive tumor, a vascular invasion in a good liver, or a bad tumor occurring in a bad liver, which is an advanced tumor in a cirrhotic liver. And depressingly, most of our patients come in the bad tumor, bad liver categories. Almost 50% of patients present in this category. The good tumor, good liver category, which is BCLC-A, these are patients who could potentially undergo a resection, is a very small proportion of the people who we normally see in clinic. So what are the arguments for liver resection? Because it's important to see both these things in context. As Dr. Shefali said, it's when a patient comes to you in clinic, often the decision is, what is the best or the most optimal treatment to offer to these patients. And predictably, like in a Facebook relationship, it is actually complicated. It's not a very straightforward answer. So when you have a patient like this, who's got a large tumor, non-cirrhotic liver, you can see that it's a tumor which is well confined with a normal looking liver, then the treatment is very simple. You do a hepatectomy and you can expect a long-term sort of good results with this, depending on the tumor biology. A patient like this, who has got a large tumor in a cirrhotic liver, has a lot more complications because you have to look at not just the tumor recurrence or the resection, but also the functional status of the liver. The pros and cons, of course, are as follows. A liver transplant is probably a complete treatment because you not only treat the tumor, but you also treat the cirrhotic liver. You remove the entire field of cancerization through total hepatectomy. It does carry a donor risk, and it can only be offered in limited hospitals across the country or in the world, actually. As opposed to liver resection, which is an individual patient's resection, it is not dependent on organ availability, and it is available in probably a few more places as compared to transplantation. And there are, of course, newer modalities such as laparoscopic carotid resection, which might improve the safety profile of this. So when we plan treatment for a patient with HCC, we of course have to look at organ availability, which differs widely across the world. DDLT being prevalent in the West as opposed to LDLT in the East. The quality of the liver in terms of the degree of cirrhotic liver function, and of course the potential for long-term recurrence, which is based on the tumor biology as well as the baseline cause of liver failure, such as hepatitis B and C, which will always carry a higher risk of tumor recurrence. And when we look at resectability, we have to see whether it's technically feasible to resect that part of the liver, whether it's oncologically appropriate, because there's no sense in resecting something with positive margins or resecting a tumor that has already undergone distant spread, and of course the host condition and fitness for surgery. Technical resectability has multiple factors. I will not go into them in this detail, but suffice it to say that we have to look at liver function, both static and dynamic. We also have to look at the degree of portal hypertension, which will in fact determine whether or not we can go ahead with a major liver resection or not. Depressingly, a very small proportion of people who present to us, even with child's A cirrhosis, are actually candidates for a major liver resection because of the risk of liver failure that happens. When we start from the reverse, when should one not offer a liver transplant? Firstly is failure to achieve the listing criteria. Patients who present with locally advanced or disseminated tumor are probably not good candidates to have this. Patients who have tumor progression with vascular invasion or extrahepatic spread, tumor size and number that remains beyond your inclusion criteria despite downstaging, or tumor progression that requires delisting and recurrence of HC after liver transplantation. These are patients perhaps who would not benefit from liver transplantation primarily. This, of course, is not counting patient-specific factors such as performance status, which will determine the suitability for both the resection as well as transplantation. Broadly speaking, these are the two criteria that are followed worldwide, with sort of honorable exceptions in several situations. The first is the Milan criteria, which was set forward in a landmark paper in the NEJM by Massafera et al., which basically said that tumors of less than 5 centimeters or 2 to 3 tumors, which are less than 3 centimeters without any disease outside the liver, could have survivals that were comparable to other non-tumorous causes of liver transplantation. This criteria was expanded by Yao et al. In 2001, which increased the size criteria, increased the number of tumors, and basically also made allowance, make sure that there was no extrahepatic spread. And the results for these very well-studied criteria are essentially 75% survival at Milan at 3 years, at 5 years, and 87.5% for UCSF at 3 years. So these are very well-studied and well-categorized criteria. But of course, this has become complicated. It's not as simple as this. So as a pop quiz, just for the audience, how many management guidelines do you think exist for hepatocellular carcinoma? And for anybody who has actually guessed more than 10, they probably should get brownie points here, because when I last checked, this was about 2-3 years ago, there are almost 22 different kinds of management guidelines. So clearly, when there are so many management guidelines, it does mean that the question that they're trying to answer is unresolved. So predominantly, one thing to understand is that biology is king. We are measuring all the other factors as a surrogate of biology, whether it is tumor size, the alpha fetoprotein level, or the degree of extrahepatic spread or invasion. The preoperative biological factors, AFP is very, very widely used at different levels. There is a survival decline at levels of more than 20, but the cutoff levels range from 200 to 400 to 1000 based on different criteria that are used. PIVCA is used as well. PET positivity is perhaps something that we in the living donor transplant world use quite a lot, because a PET positive tumor is much more likely to recur. NLR is one of the pivoting things that decides the risk of recurrence in the moral score, which is another new score that has come out. The newer things that are coming out of microanalysis, which are looking at differentially regulated genes in recurrent HCC. These basically, we have seen that there are differences in the FXR activation in checkpoint regulators as well as in hepatic cholestasis. Now, biomarkers is an area where actually there is a lot of good work coming out of India at this time. Liquid biopsy is looking at circulating tumor cells. The positive predictive value for CTC detection is almost 89%. Circulating cell-free DNA, this is currently being studied in the Rela Institute in Chennai, as well as the work that has come out of Max Hospital itself that looked at encapsulated microRNA as a circulating diagnostic marker, and particularly in patients with low AFP. So these are patients who had other markers of bad biology as compared to alpha fetoprotein, which is only elevated in about 60% of all our patients. So broadly speaking, all the criteria that we are looking at can be put in this chart, which is called the metro ticket chart. Essentially, the further away you go in terms of nodules and size, the worse your outcomes are going to be. So broadly speaking, one can decide the risk and benefit of a transplant based on the expected 5-year survival, number of nodules, and tumor size in different criteria, depending on what criteria one chooses in one's own center. So if to summarize this, the summary slide is basically in cirrhosis HCC, patients who are decompensated need a transplant. Patients who are well compensated without portal hypertension can have a resection. Patients who are within the criteria, that is Milan or UCSF, can undergo transplant directly. Patients who are outside these criteria should undergo downstaging before they actually are offered transplantation. This is probably the cliff notes of the entire presentation, in terms of a summary slide. What are the current consensus among different societies? Essentially, selection criteria, as discussed, should include tumor biology, tumor size and number, probability of survival, and transplant benefit. A risk benefit will come up at different points, and we'll just talk about this a little bit more. Liver transplant is the first line option of HCCs in cirrhotics within the Milan criteria. Although this recommendation will have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because depending on where you are, what facilities are available to you, and whether transplantation is a feasible option or not. Now, we of course live in two different worlds when transplant is considered. One is the East, where LDLT is the commonest form of transplant, living donor is the commonest form of transplant, and in the West, where deceased donor liver transplant is a common thing. The only thing that is that these two modalities have in common is the word transplantation, because the logistics and the prioritization is completely different for, say, a patient who has a living donor versus someone who has to wait on a deceased donor waiting list. So for a living donor, considering the options are, you have to be able to justify the risk that a donor goes through in order to accept a minimal acceptable recipient survival. So broadly speaking, we think that a minimum acceptable overall survival should be the same as one would expect in a patient with a non-tumor indication. So about 60% at 5 years LDLT. Now, there is a lot of difference between disease-free survival and overall survival. I think that is probably a spurious discussion, because we should consider overall survival rather than disease-free survival, because the treatment options for us, even in HCC recurrence, increase exponentially when we are dealing with a normal liver. We also should make sure that the donor risk is limited to less than 5% for major complications. Now, in DDLT, we must remember that apart from the patient criteria, we have to look at the equity of allocating an organ to the patient who would otherwise go to somebody else. So that's why we need to make sure that the survival benefit that we are getting out of the organ is comparable in patients with tumors as compared to outside tumors. So the acceptable survival is defined as 50 to 70% at 5 years. Now, within our survival criteria, if we have single small tumors, they may do as well with a resection or as with a transplant within reason, depending on the location, size, and the efficiency, the availability of portal hypertension. Patients who have fitting in within Milan criteria are awarded MEL priority scores, and these priority scores are revised every 3 months based on restaging with CT scans and AFP. Of course, this is something that is very, very contentious. Currently, there is a lot of argument about whether these priority scores are in fact justified or not. And certainly equity is something that we will continue to argue on. Certainly in our state in Karnataka, DDLT patients have to fulfill criteria within Milan criteria, and for LDLT, we take patients up to UCSF criteria. Now, when patients are waiting on a waiting list or are not able to undergo transplant immediately, will bridging therapy like TACE or TARE help? Now, this was a meta-analysis that came out in 2018, which basically showed a non-significant trend towards improved waitlist and post-transplant outcomes when bridging therapy was used in patients who were waiting. In our practice, if patients are likely to wait more than 3 months, then we would offer them bridging therapy if patients were even within Milan criteria. Perhaps the only exception would be a single tumor that was less than 3 centimeters in size. Again, the importance, the pros and cons of a waiting list. We must remember that a lot of patients who are waiting on the waiting list do drop out. So when we look at intention to treat treatment, even a high-risk liver resection in certain patient groups might have a similar survival when we look at patients who are in fact waiting for a long time for a transplant. So patients who are listed have a 24% risk of dropping out from a transplant waiting list. But perhaps this is the most important slide, because liver transplant does convey or give a long-term survival benefit. So when we look at 1-year overall survivals, they may be comparable for liver resection, liver transplant in comparable patients, but certainly the disease-free survivals are substantially better in the liver transplant group, and the overall survival benefit starting from 5 years post-transplant is substantially better in these patients. So if you have a younger patient who's cirrhotic, then perhaps a liver transplant is the right treatment to offer them. So again, to summarize the entire discussion, liver transplantation is the best treatment modality for cirrhotic patients with HCC. I should probably put an asterisk there because this is something that has to be debated and has to be guided by patient criteria, availability of donors, local expertise, and outcomes. Liver transplant within Milan criteria has the best results. As we exceed Milan criteria, our results substantially decrease, and risk benefits are defined based on region, based on allocation criteria. In our setup, living donor transplant offers better long-term survival and the option of a timely transplant. Certainly, this has to be balanced against the donor risk that we put a patient through, as well as the expected long-term survival. Patients who are waiting for a transplant should be offered bridging therapy, and certainly after patients who are being downstaged, being brought back from advanced stage into Milan criteria, should be followed up for at least 3 months before a transplant option is offered, because in order to study the tumor biology in case to see which patients drop out because of tumor recurrence. And as always, we are slaves of biology. Biology is king. That is what defines the long-term outcomes for recurrence, disease-free, as well as overall survival for HCC. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. There are 2 or 3 questions. So as you have rightly mentioned that biology is the king. So does biology is governed by the waiting time for the transplant, or do we have certain other characteristics like AFP level or other criterias which guide you, okay, this is the cutoff and beyond that you should not select the patient?
Correct.
So, yeah.
So as I've just given you a very, very broad outline, I'll tell you what specifically is done in our center and broadly in centers across India. So when a patient comes to us, we would be judging the size and number of tumors as well as major vascular invasion and extrahepatic disease. The presence of major vascular invasion, extrahepatic disease would be an indicator that the biology is aggressive. Similarly, what we use typically is alpha fetoprotein. Alpha fetoprotein is an imperfect marker in the Indian context because almost 40% of people that we come across are non-secretors. So broadly speaking, alpha fetoprotein, the level has got a direct correlation with biology. Any level that is more than 20 has a worse prognostic outcome. The cutoff that we use in our setup is more than 400 nanograms for deciding whether or not somebody is suitable for transplant in the first instance. So there are other centers that use a cutoff of 1,000, but as I've discussed in the metro ticket, it is basically the risk and the 5-year survival that one is willing to accept in one's own setting. So we use AFP. In our setup, we tend to use PET scan for these patients. We use AFP and we have started using PIVCA substantially more because a lot of our patients do turn out to be AFP negative but PIVCA positive. So there are a large number of biological tests available. They are likely to get better as cfDNA or exosome-based mRNA is more commonly indicated in practice. So we are we use biology in a very broad sense, but at this time it is still a very blunt instrument. So the difference here is downstaging and neoadjuvant therapy. Now, downstaging as by definition means downstaging to a particular level. So downstaging has a specific outcome. For example, if your outcome is getting a patient within Milan criteria. So if a patient comes to you who is outside Milan criteria, say a patient who's got a tumor of say 7 centimeters, 7.5 centimeters, then the objective of downstaging is getting them back to within Milan criteria. So that is the difference, perhaps the subtle difference between neoadjuvant therapy and downstaging in the context of liver transplantation for HCC. Okay. Now, whether one is able to downstage into that criteria or not should help one decide on two things: whether one is a candidate for transplant or not. Secondly, whether it is an indicator of aggressive biology. So that time period of 3 months, which I mentioned later, is quite an important thing, because once you treat, you have an option for the biology to declare itself. And at that time, if you see multiple nodules developing or extrahepatic disease developing, then you know that perhaps a liver transplant option would be a futile option in that situation. So I think Dr. Sharma has asked another question. That is the role for resection in reducing the dropout rate. So in certain cases, yes, resection, perhaps, I mean, this is the slide that answers your question, Dr. Aribam. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What is the perfect treatment? Liver transplantation. But can you wait for a liver transplant forever? You probably cannot. If you have a setup where you're offering resection for tumors that are maybe child, say, single tumors, easily resectable in a patient without portal hypertension, you must go ahead and do that. Okay. So I think it's important to individualize treatment based on what is available and the expertise available here.
Right. Very well said, sir. So what kind of bridging therapy, in your experience, you rely on, or evidence-based, which can do the job for it?
Okay. So tumors that are within Milan, multiple tumors within Milan, are typically treated with TACE therapy in our setup. If it is a single tumor within Milan less than 4 centimeters, then we would consider RFA. RFA because in our experience, RFA actually has better tumor kill and better support as compared to TACE in the long term, because the reality is that waiting lists are unpredictable for DDLT in our country. In a very, very select group of patients who have had segmental portal vein thrombosis, we have tried to give TARE therapy as a downstaging modality. We have not transplanted anybody who we have given TARE so far. But these are the 3 modalities which we are more likely to use. I mean, I must say that, qualify that, nowadays we are using microwave more often than we are using a radio frequency ablation.
Right, sir. And any kind of a scenario case or any kind of situation where you would prefer to go for adjuvant also, systemic therapy post-transplant. So is there any criteria where you keep in mind, okay, I know that is not a perfect situation, but is there any case scenario where you would like to prefer continuation of adjuvant treatment?
So, I mean, essentially, the larger studies that have happened for adjuvant therapy in a post-transplant setting have not shown a survival benefit. There's been some modest survival benefit, non-significant survival benefit in a recent study that has come out of India, which was published earlier this year. At this time, we are not offering any adjuvant therapy for patients post-transplantation. I think there's probably a little bit more evidence in terms of the immunosuppression that we use. I have not discussed that because this is a GI oncology group, but certainly the mTOR inhibitors, early adoption of mTOR inhibition has got some survival benefit in certain trials that we use. So basically, we would use early induction of everolimus rather than sirolimus now, and sort of rely on the survival benefit that it gives.
Right, sir. So thank you so much, sir. So now we move on to the panel discussion, and I would request you to be there in the panel also. And sir, please, if you can stop sharing so that I think Dr. Shaleen can take over. So I welcome Dr. Shaleen. He's a transplant surgeon again in Max Hospital, Saket. And he would be moderating the panel discussion on role of liver transplant in hepatocellular carcinomas. And sir, I welcome you to take over the stage. And his panelists would be Dr. Asthana, Dr. Elaine Kumaran, who is again a GI surgeon in Kuveri Hospital, Chennai, Dr. Madhu Mehta, who is a hepatologist in PGI Chandigarh, Dr. V. Arun Kumar, who is again a hepatologist in Apollo Hospital, New Delhi, and Dr. Suhail Qureshi, who is a medical oncologist in Fortis Hospital, Shalimar Bagh. So, sir, please take over and continue.
Thank you, Dr. Shefali. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Nikhil and Dr. Shefali for inviting me on this forum. And I think this is a very pertinent topic when we are discussing HCCs, because transplantation has become a very important part of the armamentarium or the treatment modalities that are available. And Dr. Sonal has nicely covered in a very short time the entire gamut of transplant options, the pros and cons. So my job today, what I was told was to how to apply this knowledge, which Dr. Asthana has talked about, in the real life setting, in the daily ROPDs and IN patients, how we do apply this knowledge to the actual patient management. And that's why I have chosen 3 cases to discuss amongst our esteemed panelists. So I would share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir, it is.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So the role of transplantation in management of HCC. So welcome all the panelists. I welcome you all. So I'll just, in 3-4 slides, I'll give a summary of what Dr. Asthana has said, and Dr. Sonal has given a overview, but it's just 3-4 slides which are very practically applicable. So few points, especially for the students and the young surgeons and physicians who are attending this discussion. So things is that HCC is not an uncommon malignancy. Unfortunately, it carries a high mortality because we don't have many adjuvant treatment modalities available as of date, although newer molecules are being introduced, but unfortunately not many of them have shown dramatic change in outcomes. Although a lot of claims have been made in the studies, but we have all realized in our practice that not many adjuvant options are available to these patients. And another part which Dr. Asthana has also emphasized, and I think it can be re-emphasized, that most of these tumors arise on the background of liver cirrhosis. So as he said, again, I will reiterate that we are dealing with 2 conditions. That is the underlying cirrhosis as well as the HCC. So that's why the treatment planning would also depend on the stage of the disease, that is the spread of the tumor and what criteria it fits in. And at the same time, we have to see the condition of the underlying liver. For that, we use the CTP scoring or the MELD scoring systems for seeing what is the stage of decompensation of the liver underlying cirrhosis. So the treatment modalities have been summarized in this slide quickly. So surgery is the mainstay of treatment. It is the major modality of curative treatment for HCCs, and surgery includes both resection and transplantation. Ablative therapies, RFA, microwave, cryoablation. RFA and microwave are the ones which are being used most often. Again, they form part of the definitive treatment armamentarium, as well as part of the downstaging protocols. Embolization, again, a very important therapy, but mainly for palliation and downstaging. It could be a chemoembolization or a radioembolization. Each one has their own pros and cons. Radiotherapy, especially the targeted radiotherapy for tumor thrombi, and again, it's palliative or for downstaging. And then chemotherapy or includes the kinase inhibitors such as sorafenib, lenvatinib, PD-1 inhibitors, and mainly they have a palliative role. Again, as Dr. Shefali had asked and Dr. Asthana rightly said, that they don't really have a role in adjuvant settings. Studies have till date not shown any major advantage of adding them in the post-transplant or post-resection, leading to any survival advantage. So we, as in our practice, do not routinely prescribe these medications in the adjuvant setting. They are reserved mainly for palliation, but Dr. Sohail may be able to shed more light on this. So coming to liver transplantation per se, I would like to emphasize only 3 points. One, it has a dual role. It is the most comprehensive management of liver cancer. Unlike other cancers in other parts of the body, it not only treats the cancer, but also the underlying disease, which primarily has led to the evolution of that cancer, because healthy livers rarely have tumors in them. They do have, but very uncommon. Liver transplantation offers the best hope of long-term survival, but the caveat remains that they have to be within criteria, either the Milan criteria or the UCSF criteria. And I think most centers, at least in India, follow the UCSF criteria, which is just a slight expansion of the Milan criteria, where the tumor diameters, it's basically based on the number and the size of the tumor. So it's the UCSF is a slight expansion of Milan, just in order to include more patients into the ambit of liver transplant, so that more patients can benefit. And it's been repeatedly shown, starting right from Professor Yao's paper in late 90s, that despite the modest increase, the outcomes are almost as good as Milan. And for patients who present with tumors outside the criteria, there is still hope, because it has been now clearly shown that patients which can be downstage to within Milan do have a reasonably good survival. So before I start the case presentation per se, I would, this slide is just to show in which cases there is no controversy. So who would be an ideal candidate for liver transplant? It would be a middle-aged. Why middle-aged? Because you can offer them very good survival vis-a-vis a patient of 75 years or 70 years whom you are choosing for transplant. Ambulatory, that is good performance status. That I tell my patients who come for liver transplant that the patients who come walking go home walking. So a good performance status is very essential, because liver transplant per se is a major insult to the body in the initial first 2 weeks, and the patient's reserve should be enough to withstand those 2 weeks. Should have decompensated cirrhosis, although childs are good enough, but in our experience we have seen that patients who present with decompensated cirrhosis, they get this actual dual benefit. That is, you are treating this liver disease which has already decompensated, and at that same time, you are treating their tumors. HCC within criteria, that is the UCS criteria that we all in India follow. AFP values of less than 100, and as was said by Dr. Sonal, that different centers have different cutoffs. But yes, there was a study from United States multi-center study which said that less than 100, if you have AFP less than 100, then the survival outcomes are better. But different cutoffs have been shown, 400 and up to 1000. But again, the higher the AFP values, AFP actually is a very, very important prognostic marker. And as it's a very important indicator, surrogate for the biology of the tumor. So higher the AFP, the higher the chances of recurrence in the long term. Whatever value you choose as a cutoff, but the basic fact remains, higher the value, the higher the chance of recurrence. FDG non-evident PET CT with no evidence of extrahepatic disease. These tumors are considered to be metabolically less active and therefore less aggressive. So a middle-aged ambulatory patient with decompensated cirrhosis with HCC within UCSF criteria, low FP values, and a PET non-avid tumor, this would be an ideal candidate for liver transplant. So I'm not putting up any case. Almost 40-50% cases fall into this criteria that present to our OPDs, and there is no controversy about these patients. You cannot offer any other modality. You cannot resect them, and offering them RFA, ablation, or TACE, is not going to help them. You are doing a disservice by not offering transplant to these patients. So there's no controversy. Now coming to a more practical scenario, and we are like, as I said, 50 to 60% of patients will present where there are some dilemmas, and therefore I have chosen 3 representative cases where we can discuss about these dilemmas. So the case one I would start is a 47 years male, a known case of chronic hepatitis B for the last 6 years. There are no known comorbidities. Patient is asymptomatic with a very good performance status. He's been on antiviral medication, and currently he has undetectable viral load. So this question I would put to Dr. Madhumita, who's a hepatologist and would be dealing with such cases. How would you follow up a patient with chronic hepatitis B?
So this is a bit of a loaded question, sir, because this patient is 47-year-old and was detected with chronic hepatitis B for 6 years.
Yes.
But we know that in India, people are living with hepatitis B because it's essentially horizontal transmission. So it's just possible that he was detected at the first screening 6 years ago, maybe at the age of 40, but might have been living with HBV for a long time. And now we know that unlike Hep C, where the risk of HCC is related to the underlying fibrosis, but in HBV, unfortunately, the risk of of developing carcinoma is related to the total duration, the level of HBV DNA, the degree of integration of the genome of HBV into the human DNA, as well as covalently close triple C DNA. So all of these, and also, comorbidities, as you have mentioned, is not there, but one has to specifically ask for alcohol intake. So the more the number of issues that are there, the more the risk of HCC. So we are knowing that this patient has good performance status and is asymptomatic and is currently being treated. So I would like to know what is his liver stiffness measurement, and in case, what is his ALT? Is there any evidence of necroinflammation? If the patient is cirrhotic, then he will require 6 monthly screening for HCC. And in some patients where we are having some kind of dysplastic nodules, or there is strong family history of HCC, one would screen more often. So the follow-up actually depends on the level of fibrosis, how long the patient has been living with hepatitis B. And it is not just a question of since detection. We have to actually check how long the patient has had it.
Okay, I think you have very rightly put it, that it would all depend on, because he must have picked it up earlier. It was only most of these patients are incidentally detected. So just a second. So yes, so as you rightly said, that it would all depend how long the patient has been with hepatitis B, but as to our knowledge, he was detected 6 years back. So what investigations that we recommended and our hepatologist would do is the routine blood investigations, a fibroscan and serum AFP every 6 months. And fibroscan is done only at the baseline. If the patient is found to be cirrhotic, we don't repeat the fibroscans. But yes, we do a closer follow-up, because once the cirrhosis develops, the likelihood of developing cancers and increases. Although, as you rightly said, that in hepatitis B, de novo cancers, even without fibrosis, are well known. So the blood investigations that we recommend are the routine CBC, LFT, KFT, INR, and serum AFP every 4 months. The hemoglobin was 10 gram, platelets were above 1 lakh, bilirubin 1.6, creatinine, renal functions were all normal. Albumin was also well preserved, 3.2, and AFP value was 87. Ultrasound abdomen gave indication that he had already become cirrhotic. So because it showed an irregular outline of the liver. And at the same time, incidentally, it was found that he has a solitary 4 centimeter SOL in the right lobe of the liver. There was no associated ascites or evidence of portal vein thrombosis. So what would be the next investigation? Dr. Ilan Kumaran, if you are there, please answer this question. Dr. Ilan, are you there? So if Dr. Ilan
I can't see her. I can't see his name, sir. Probably he.
So I'll pass on this question to Dr. Arun. Dr. Arun?
Hello, sir. Hi, sir.
So please, what would be the next investigation that you would like to offer this patient?
Sir, I would like to go ahead with CT, most likely PET CT, which includes
Oh, so what we usually do is that instead of straight away going for a PET CT, we prefer to do an MRI these days. Although there is, as per the studies, there is no data that to choose one over the other. But what we have seen is that MRI, contrast MRI especially, gives more information in terms of the morphology of nodules in cirrhotic background. Because as we all are aware that cirrhotic livers more often tend to have these multiple regenerating nodules, and a CT sometimes doesn't give you a clear-cut information because the classical arterial phase enhancement and the washout may not be seen in the smaller tumor, smaller nodules that is around 2 centimeter. So as a first investigation, we like to do a triple phase MRI, but any of these two modalities can be used depending on the center's preference. And as I just said, that MRI scores over CT is picking up smaller tumors. That's why we these days have shifted from CT to doing routine MRIs in these patients just to confirm the ultrasound findings. But continuing with you, Dr. Arun, what is the role of PET CT? Now you tell about in HCC assessment. What is the exact role of PET CT?
the most important role of PET CT is to identify extrahepatic metastasis to see whether there are any uptake within the primary tumor or whether there is any uptake in the extrahepatic region like the lung, liver, and bone. And one more most important thing is we can know about the tumor biology. The PET is non-FDG avid. Most likely, it could be a less malignant when compared to a PET avid tumors.
So I would like to ask Dr. Sonal that have you faced any fallacies with regards to PET CT?
Yes, quite substantially. So I think that I agree with the second part of what Arun has said. Certainly, an FDG avid tumor would be indicator of poor biology, and there's a large number of studies from the East which suggest that FDG avidity itself is linked with a poor disease-free and overall survival in the LDNT setting. The fallacies that we face typically are in the identification of extrahepatic disease.
Yes.
So we feel that FDG actually overcalls a lot of nodules where we ended up chasing our tails, especially nodules in the subcarinal region, etc., etc. So I think that FDG correlation of primary and secondary is very, very erratic. So you can have an FDG avid primary and non-FDG avid secondaries. You can have FDG avid secondaries. And broadly speaking, you can have a large number of people who fall in the intermediate SUV range, which actually are the biggest confounders for us. So I think that although there is value in identifying the primary tumor, but the distant metastasis, especially when they are oligometastasis or low SUV, should be taken with a pinch of salt.
So I would like
So
to ask,
may I add something?
What are his views about doing a routine PET CT when you are dealing with a cirrhotic patient with HCC, and probably you are considering him for some kind of curative therapy in terms of surgery?
Yeah. So may I go forward? May I go ahead?
Please, please.
Yeah, so I was just trying to take forward the point which Dr. Sonal sir was making, that yes, PET CT comes with its own inherent fallacies and detecting false positives. Right now, we have a patient in our ward right now who is a hepatitis B carrier and diagnosed with hepatocellular carcinoma. And he has portal hypertension with ascites. Now, when the PET CT was done, we also discovered some omental stranding and some omental nodularity. Now, we initially wanted this to be assessed because there was no other site of disease and patient is an otherwise fit patient. So when we asked our intervention radiologist to go ahead and do the omental sampling, he clearly told us that it was too small to be sampled. And perhaps the kind of patients he sees every now and then with CLD, omental stranding is pretty much very common with patients of chronic liver disease itself. Now, this patient also had ascites, and we got the ascites tab. It did not reveal any malignant cells, and it was a high SAG ascites, typical transudative ascites. So yes, PET scan has the implication of, putting in a question mark in your mind whether really this patient has any extrahepatic disease or not, and therefore it was always to be taken up with a pinch of salt.
So that was the point I was trying to come up with, and Dr. Suhail, you have made that point very nicely. that PET-CT definitely has a role, especially what Dr. Arun said, that avidity leads to, it is a poor prognostic marker. But the problem with PET-CT is that many a times it would give you false positive findings. Besides the omental stranding that was mentioned by Dr. Sohail, many a times you would see lymph nodes in the abdomen lighting up on PET-CT. You biopsy them, you needle them, and ultimately they turn out to be inflammatory. You may find some small non-descript nodules in the lungs, and again then you have to go after those nodules, getting them biopsied, CT guided or endobronchially. So it becomes a very tedious path, and ultimately you end up nowhere. So our enthusiasm for doing routine PET-CT in these patients has waned these days, although we still do them, but we have become more selective. So what patients in our practice we would choose for doing a PET-CT would be those who have poor prognostic markers like outside criteria patients, large multiple nodules, high AFP or PIVKA patients, we would do PET-CT. But a routine patient presenting within the Milan or the UCSF with an AFP which is less than 100, we may omit PET-CT for the reasons that we just discussed. So PET-CT definitely has a role, but yes, there are certain fallacies which have to be kept in mind. So we should not go after each and every lymph node that in the abdomen that lights up on a PET-CT or a small nodule or the lung or the umbilical stranding that was mentioned by Sohail. And ultimately, they all turn out to be negative, and the patient ends up being unnecessarily needed. And many of these investigations, they are invasive investigations. And mind you, we have exogenic complications. We have seen many of these as a result of these investigations. So we have become more choosy with regards to investigating everything like upon a PET-CT. So the imaging results are as follows. It was a cirrhotic normal sized liver, a 4.8 centimeter by 3.5 centimeter as well. Solitary lesion was seen in the segment 8, and it showed the classical characteristics of NHCC. It was Leydig spike with no portovein thrombosis or ascites. Patient had moderate splenomegaly. We did a PET-CT. Again, it had a mild FDG uptake in the range of SB max of 3.9. The tumor dimensions are mentioned. Luckily, there was no other lesion in the liver, and the PET in this particular case did not show any extrahepatic disease. So summarizing this case, he's a middle-aged patient with cirrhosis secondary to chronic hepatitis B, good performance status. He falls in child's A category, and he's got a solitary HCC in segment 8 of the liver with a serum AFP of 87. So what are the treatment options? Dr. Arun, starting with you, what are the treatment options available for this patient?
Since the patient is a child A, we have two options left. The first option, which I will consider, is liver resection, because the patient had a good performance status, child A status, bilirubin is normal, and I would also like to look at his upper GI endoscopy, whether varices is present or not. I would also like, and his platelets are almost like 1 lakh, so probably portal hypertension unlikely, but I would like to do upper GI endoscopy to decide about whether we can go ahead with the liver resection or not.
Okay, so Dr. Madhumita, would you routinely do HVPG in these patients before sending them to the surgeon?
So in a patient who requires a major resection, we would require definitely a endoscopy, number one, to look for clinically significant portal hypertension, and then see the residual. If there are evidence of varices, then we know the HVPG is going to be more than 10. In such cases, one would not bother to do an HVPG assessment. But in case there is a difference of opinion, then one should do an HVPG at least.
Like in this particular case we are talking about, he's absolutely like he's a child's A patient. Platelet count is above 1 lakh, bilirubin is normal, albumin is nearly normal, there's no ascites, though there is some evidence of a mild splenomegaly, but there are no significant collaterals on the imaging.
No, his albumin is low. It is
3.2. Yeah.
And
So,
his platelets are low. They are 1 lakh.
Yeah.
So this patient could well be harboring portal hypertension. If
Yeah.
there are no varices on endoscopy, then well, one can be relatively safe. It's not CSPH. But
So yeah, there are certain indicators that he has underlying portal hypertension, which has not manifested itself grossly in the form of ascites or any GI bleed episodes. And many of these patients do show grade 1 varices, which again have to be taken with a pinch of salt because they are more subjective findings. So this patient has some indicators to suggest portal hypertension, but I just wanted your comment for the sake of the audience that in what particular cases you will do HVPG.
So if I have to offer major resection to a cirrhotic, albeit a compensated cirrhotic, I would like to know what is the functional capacity of the liver. So tests like indocyanine drain test can also give some indication about quantitative liver function test. Before offering a major resection, I would do an HVPG.
Sure. Thank you. So Dr. Sonal, coming to you, because that's the next thing. What is your thought on ICG?
So ICG is a very useful modality for functional assessment. ICG retention obviously is associated with worse outcomes in patients for whom we are contemplating a major resection. This particular patient has a large tumor, will require a major hepatectomy, has evidence of low albumin, that is poor synthetic function, as well as portal hypertension. So actually, in my view, if you had a suitable donor, then I would think that actually a liver transplant would be a preferable option as compared to a resection in this particular patient. But if we were going forward with a resection, we should make sure that we have measured the HVPG as agreed. I agree with my colleague. Make sure that the portal hypertension is within limits. The second is if we have any dynamic measurements available like ICG, we should use them. And the FLR is at least more than 40%.
Sure. But just to play the devil's advocate, Dr. Sohail, why not ablation? We have very good results with ablative therapies. This is a 4 centimeter tumor. Though 3 centimeter is the cutoff, but there are newer studies where up to 5 centimeters, the results are as good as resection. So what are your thoughts about offering ablation to these patients?
It really depends on what is the location of this tumor, how close it is to the diaphragm.
Segment 8 of the liver.
Okay, so yeah, segment 8. Sorry, I just forgot that. So my first attempt would be to give him the best possible shot. He's a very fit patient, yeah. And if this is the kind of patient we cannot take up for transplant, then who else? So yes, my first intention would be to send him to a transplant colleague for a workup for a transplant, because this is the best kind of patient who would perhaps be benefiting the most from that intervention. So I would rather be slightly skeptical of offering him ablation, because this patient would fit the bill the best for going ahead with the transplant.
Yeah, but as mentioned in Dr. Sonal's talk, that there are many cons associated with transplant with regards to the logistics, availability of the donor. If you are planning for a DDLT, then it might be an endless waiting game. So there are many difficulties with actually going ahead with transplant. It's not that it's freely available. And then there is a definite mortality associated with liver transplant. He's a very fit patient. So do you think ablation has a role, or any of our panelists would like to speak? Dr. Madhumita, what is your thought about ablative therapy in this patient?
Ablative therapy, this is 4.8 centimeters, I believe.
Yes.
So it's
a borderline thing.
One could, I mean, it's a young patient. If he wants to go ahead for ablation, one can follow up closely. AFP is also elevated. One can offer ablative therapy, but it's not going to be curative. This would probably be a bridging therapy.
Yes, that is the most important point. And please reiterate that point for the benefit of our young audience.
So this is not, I mean, these kind of loco-regional therapies for anything larger than 3 centimeters of lesion is not going to be curative. One has to be very clear to the patient that this is only going to offer a partial cure. And after a while, the residual tumor cells are likely to progress. This is a cirrhotic patient after all. And that's only in the target lesion. The fact that carcinogenesis has happened in one part of the liver does not prevent it from coming in some other site. So if the gene mutations and the molecular alterations have accumulated, then in a young fit patient, if we should always offer curative intent. So I would choose either resection with a backup of transplant, or I would go for transplant directly.
Thank you. So coming to this debate of resection versus transplantation and how to choose. So what has been recommended and what most of us would follow is this slide. I think I put up the criteria. So one would consider transplant if the patient is decompensated, that is more than child's A. His bilirubin is more than 2, platelet counts less than 1 lakh, suggestive of significant portal hypertension. Same is true for splenomegaly. So these are all the points which go against resection: presence of collaterals on the imaging, varices on upper GI endoscopy, HVPG we have talked about, ICG, like this would be a major resection. So ICG retention at 15 minutes more than 10% is a strict no. And of course, the tumor location is very important. That was pointed out by Dr. Sohail. So when you are seeing such a patient and you have stuck with the dilemma of resection versus transplantation, I think all these points have to be considered. And if the patient has any one or more of these points going against resection, then you should not offer resection to these patients. You should err on the side of doing less in terms of resection and choosing transplant, because post-resection liver failure is a very definite mortality and with very poor survival outcomes. Most of these patients don't make it and may need an emergency transplant to salvage them. And again, emergency transplant is not an easy thing to do and the outcomes are not good. So moving on. So this patient, as everybody pointed out, we performed a transplant because he had indicators of portal hypertension, and since the tumor was situated in segment 8, which is a difficult area to approach and needs a major resection. So it would have at least required a segment 8 or at least an anterior sectoral hepatectomy, and which in view of the existing portal hypertension would have increased the risk of post resection liver failure. We offered a liver transplant. And the follow-up protocol that we follow is we would do monthly blood tests in the form of CBC, LFT, KFT, and TAC level for the first 3 months, and 3 monthly AFPs. And then gradually, as the time passes, the frequency of the tests comes down. We'll do imaging in the form of an MRI every 6 months for 2 years and annually for the next 5 years. So this is our follow-up protocol, but there are many variations to the protocols depending on the center, and no one can say that which one is better, but this is what we have been following. So coming to the next case, and I recently operated upon this patient. So he was a 65 years old, otherwise healthy male, incidentally detected to have liver cirrhosis. And there was a SOL on, SOL on USG during evaluation for a right upper quadrant pain. He had normal CBC, LFT, KFT, and INR. He fell in the child's A category. His serum AFP was more than 100,000, and PIVCA, we have been routinely doing PIVCA for the last 2 years now, because Dr. Sonal had pointed out that only 40% of the patients may not have elevated AFP. Therefore, adding PIVCA to it increases the sensitivity of picking up the bad biology tumors. So his PIVCA and both serum AFP and PIVCA were markedly elevated. We performed an MRI which showed cirrhotic changes in the liver, and there were 3 tumors in the liver. One was a roughly 3 centimeters SOL in straddling segment 6 and 7, another satellite nodule 1.2 centimeter, and there was a segment 6 nodule which was 1.5 centimeter, all located in the right lobe of the liver. There was moderate splenomegaly with prominent collaterals at the splenic hilum. There was no associated portal vein thrombosis or ascites. And we did a PET scan because of the very high AFP and PIVCA values, but fortunately it didn't show any extrahepatic disease. Upper GI endoscopy revealed grade 2 varices. So, Dr. Sonal, what would be your approach for this particular patient?
So this gentleman clearly has a bad biology disease by our definition.
Yes.
Although morphologically the disease seems to be sort of well controlled, but the AFP is very, very high. So in this situation, we have to assume
it was 1,12,000 to be precise.
So I think that I would probably do a PET scan first in this patient.
You did it.
Okay, what did you find?
Yeah, but there was no evidence of any extrahepatic disease, mild FDG avidity.
Okay, so this would be a patient who I would first consider for bridging or downstaging therapy. Primarily because, as we had discussed before, the objective of downstaging is to get the AFP down to a level or the biology down to a more predictable level, so that we can accurately prognosticate what the long-term survival is likely to be. At an alpha fetoprotein that is that high, we have to assume that either there is disease that we are missing, either intrahepatic or extrahepatically. So there are two things that we would need to achieve. We would need to sort of perhaps treat the tumor locoregionally, as well as give it some time to declare itself in terms of biology before we offer transplantation.
Great. So Dr. Sohail and Dr. Madhumita, your opinion with this regard, what would be your approach? Dr. Sohail first, followed by Dr. Madhumita.
So I would agree. I think this is a bad tumor biology as evidenced by a very high level of the alpha fetoprotein. And although there are only 3 lesions and none of them are higher than 5 centimeters, but I would wait for the disease, the tumor biology to eventually delineate the future course of action and perhaps go for a bridging therapy before he's taken up for a curative intent transplant.
Madhumita?
Sir, I have a question. Does the primary lesion on the PET CT, is it showing FDG avidity?
Yes, I said it was mildly avid, but SUV max was less than 5.
So that is an issue because if we are using the PET CT as a screening tool for extrahepatic disease, we need to have the tumor itself be highly FDG avid. AFP more than 1 lakh suggests that there is likely to be either microvascular invasion or there might be extrahepatic disease, and maybe this kind of tumor is not very FDG avid. So, using that as a yardstick may be erroneous in this case. So I think the question of bridging and waiting for the patient to show what is the true, we can't change the tumor biology. It is going to progress with time, and something with this high biomarkers on both PIVKA and AFP is going to progress. So if this is a case where one has to weigh the likelihood of progression. We can offer bridging therapy as was suggested and see how it plays out after 3 months. And if levels go down, one can then offer a curative transplant. Or if one transplants first, one has to realize that this is a candidate which is going to recur after transplantation or has a high likelihood to do so.
So I think we do have a consensus that some form of downstaging, I would say, because of the very raised PIVKA and DFP value is recommended by the panelists. And mind you, Dr. Madhumita, when you do a transplant and it recurs within a year, facing the family is a big challenge because the family has very high hopes. The patient and the family have very high hopes from transplant. After all, it's a very major undertaking if you look at it from the family standpoint, because a young donor is coming forward for donation and they expect cure. So when you have such high values, straight away going transplant may not be advisable. And actually, some people have suggested that biology is the king. That's true, that these patients should not be offered transplant at all because invariably they recur within the first 1 or 2 years. So Dr. Arun, if we go for some form of downstaging, what would be the modality of choice in your opinion?
So I agree with all my panelists. So the tumor is like very bad, had a very bad biology. So the main plan would be like going ahead with the downstaging procedure and follow up with AFP and PIVKA2 levels after 3 months. And the most common procedures which we usually do is transarterial chemoembolization. Transarterial chemoembolization of the lesions, particularly the 3 centimeter lesion. And sir, I would like to ask whether there is any evidence of second order branch PVTT there in the SPECT CT.
Oh, there, as I mentioned, there was no evidence of PVT on the MRI. MRI is quite sensitive.
Okay. So I would like to go ahead with transarterial chemoembolization and I would follow up with AFP and PIVKA.
So I think there is a consensus, and we did what you just said. So we did a downstaging with TACE, and luckily all the tumors were on the right side. Actually, the left side was not very big, and most of the liver mass was on the right side only. And we did a TACE. And this patient presented to us first time in March, 27th March. I still remember the date when we did the TACE. And then we kept on observing him, kept on following him with every 2 weeks we did AFP values. He was from Sikkim, so PIVKA was not available there. He kept on sending me his AFP values, and from 1,12,000, they came to around 700. So we called him over, and then we did a repeat MRI and a PET also, it's been missed here. So that did not show any progression of the disease. And as I just mentioned, AFP values had fallen dramatically from more than 1 lakh to less than 1,000. Therefore, the patient was subjected to an LDLT from his son. So this is the picture, the MRI pictures, the pre and post. You can see the difference. These are the pictures pre and post taste. So the tumor after taste is hardly lighting up except for this small nodule in this part of the one part of the tumor. And the histology that came out finally on explant was that it was a 96% tumor necrosis, but the 4% that was there was a grade 3 tumor. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. I had consulted the family regarding the chance of recurrence to the tune of about 20%. So this is how, like, this case I chose specifically to highlight the importance of the tumor markers, the AFP and PIVCA, and these has been repeatedly shown in literature that despite the tumor within Milan or within UCSF, you see very frequent recurrences if you have high AFP values. So these patients, either they are not offered transplant, but if you have to offer transplant, it's better to downstage, wait, give the biology to time for the biology to manifest itself, like 3-4 months that we gave to this patient. And then if you are satisfied with the response to the downstaging therapy and there is no evidence of progression, at least there should be stable disease on the post downstaging imaging modality, then only you progress to transplant. You have to be very cautious in transplanting these patients.
Dr. Shalin, may I make a comment on this PIVCA actually? I think that I just wanted to say something about PIVCA, because PIVCA are basically proteins that are induced by vitamin K or vitamin K dependent clotting factors or antagonists.
Yeah.
So in situations which have got high INR or patients on anticoagulation will actually have high PIVCA values.
High PIVCA values.
So especially when you have patients with Budd-Chiari who have multiple nodules who are perhaps on warfarin, please reverse the warfarin before you check the PIVCA. Okay, that's sort of a very important operational point.
Yeah, thank you. But do you agree with what the treatment plan that we followed in this patient, or any of the panelists has some comments to make about it?
No, I think that it was very good that you got an excellent response and you followed through with it, which is given him the best survival possibility actually. So I think that's really good.
Yeah, so this is the message I would like to give to our young surgeons and physicians, that please be very, despite the tumor being within criteria, don't be very over enthusiastic about subjecting these patients to an early transplant, because we have burnt our fingers in the past, and I think everybody has had bad experiences when patients, despite being within criteria, recurred just because we tried to ignore the importance of the tumor markers. So moving to the third and the last case, because I think we are running out of time, I'll quickly go through this case. This was a 39-year-old gentleman, known case of chronic hepatitis C. This is a patient we treated about a year back. Good performance status. He had achieved SVR after 12-week course of antiviral agent, CTPA again, and then he had an incidentally detected lesion in the right lobe of liver on ultrasound. MRI confirmed the solitary right lobe as well, 4.1 centimeter to be an HCC, but this time he had a thrombus in the right branch of the portal vein along with it. There was evidence of portal hypertension in terms of borderline splenomegaly with dilated coronary vein. Upper GI endoscopy showed grade 1 esophageal varices. His AFP was less than 1000 but still elevated. And PET CT showed an FDG with liver lesions and a portal vein thrombus. No extrahepatic disease. So this is the picture of this particular patient. We have the tumor, and then we have the thrombus in the right branch of the portal vein. So what is the nature of these thrombus? Dr. Arun, how would you determine on the basis of imaging that whether this is a tumor thrombus or a bland thrombus? Because bland thrombi are very common in patients with long-standing cirrhosis.
Tumor thrombus are generally expansile. The diameter of the portal vein gets increased because of the expansion. And the other most important thing will be the contrast enhancement in the arterial phase within the portal vein, within the tumor thrombus. These two are the most common things which you look at whether to find out whether it is a tumor thrombus or a bland thrombus.
So Dr. Arun very rightly said, and I've summarized the points that you made in this slide. So characteristics of a tumor thrombus are enhancement in the arterial phase itself, that is venous enhancement of the thrombus in the arterial phase, widening of or distension of the vein, increase in venous diameter, and elevated serum AFP is a very strong indicator that this thrombus is not a bland thrombus, it's a tumor thrombus, and presence of thrombus in the close vicinity of the tumor. So these 4 points are the criteria on the basis of which you can differentiate between a tumor thrombus vis-a-vis a bland thrombus. So, Dr. Sohail, what are the available options, treatment options? The same question again for this particular patient. Dr. Sohail, are you still there? Hello, am I audible? Dr. Shefali, can you hear me?
Dr. Sohail, yeah, Dr. Sohail, you should unmute actually. I think you are on mute, that is why.
So if by any reason Dr. Sohail is unable to take this question, I'll pass on the question to Dr. Madhumita. Hello?
Sir, you are audible. I mean, at least I can hear you all.
So Dr. Sonal, please
I
answer.
hope you are audible to others.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, you are very well audible.
Okay, I think okay, Suhail is not able to unmute himself for some reason.
Yeah,
So
both
essentially,
Sohail and Madhumita are not able to get my question, I believe.
I'm sorry, was it put to me?
Yeah, Dr. Madhumita,
So
initially.
if it's a bland thrombus, then there's no issue at all. I mean, it's very smooth.
true.
There's only a branch portal vein
But I
thrombus.
think there are certain indicators to suggest that this is not a bland thrombus. He has
If
high
it is
FP.
a tumor thrombus and it is showing arterial enhancement and washout just the way the HCC would, if it is
Yeah, it is
showing
unlikely to
heavy
be a bland.
turbidity, yeah. If it's a tumoral thrombus, then I would offer a tear in such a patient, a Y90 tear, because that would give a good response even if there is a portal vein thrombus. Even DEPTase can be used, but tear has got better outcomes and less chance of post locoregional therapy decompensation.
Okay, so how would DEPTase take care of the tumor thrombus? It could take care of the main tumor, but I think there is the tumor thrombus is although close but some distance away. So I agree with tear, but how would DEPTase deal with the tumor part of?
It wouldn't. So normally in these kind of patients, we are combining tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or we would give immunotherapy. So a combination therapy would show better options. And in PVT at our center, we are using SBRT as well. So that can focus specifically the tumor thrombus and has got excellent results.
So that is what we did. A tear is a very good option, but it's very expensive actually. It costs around 14 to 15 lakhs in our center. So many patients, because of the financial reasons, are unable to go for a tear. So what we did was the second best option. I would say it's equally good. There are no studies to prove the superiority of one over the other. We did a super selective TACE for the main tumor. We offered SBRT for the main tumor thrombus, waited for the tumor biology to show up, repeated a contrast MRI and a PET scan after 12 weeks. So luckily for this patient, the tumor thrombus had become bland and there was no evidence of extrahepatic disease on PET. And the AFP had significantly come down, though not less than 100, but it was still reasonably low, 312. And therefore, we subjected this patient to a liver transplant after 3 months of the downstaging with the hope, although we are not expecting that he would behave the same as a patient within bland criteria, but he had shown very good response to our downstaging protocol. So we did a liver transplant in this patient and it's been almost 1 year, I would say 11 months since we did the transplant. He continues to remain tumor free, but we are keeping our fingers crossed because it was an aggressive disease to begin with. So with this, I would end the cases. I would be happy to take questions for our panelists from the audience or for me if we can answer any questions from the audience.
Sir, I have a small comment to make, sir, if I may just say so.
Yeah, please.
I mean, we have been extensively transplanting patients with HCC, but now we are finding a lot of these cases. In fact, it's a whole new disease process in itself. post-transplant early recurrence of HCC. Now, I completely agree, stage for stage, the best survival outcomes are available with with transplant, no doubt. But this whole new issue of managing patient with early transplant recurrence is a major problem. We are having 2 patients currently with us who are having a recurrence within a year of the transplant.
So I have a slide for that also. And that is, I think every center who's transplanting patients with HCC has seen cases, and we are no different. So there comes the role for adjuvant therapy or palliative role of biologicals. And there are patients who have shown very good response with, at least with lenvatinib. So sorafenib, we had disappointing results, but we have had reasonably good results in terms of stable disease for up to 2.5 years with lenvatinib. And we have offered combination of lenvatinib followed by nivolumab, but patients don't tend to tolerate nivolumab that well as lenvatinib. So our mainstay of therapy in these patients with recurrence are either ablation, which could be an RFA or microwave, if it's a solitary or a localized recurrence, along with or solitary use of kinase inhibitors, especially lenvatinib.
Sir, I completely agree that TKIs would actually be the choice. After transplant, there's a problem giving checkpoint inhibitors because they induce an immune flare and can trigger rejection, or
Yes.
they can trigger at least a flare of acute hepatitis. So we have burnt our fingers with post-transplant recurrence and given nivolumab in that case, but certainly pre-transplant, it's an excellent choice.
Dr. Sohail, what has been your experience with regards to managing recurrences?
Sir, probably he had some issue and has left. So this was my next question to you and the panelist also. See, if the recurrence occurs as maybe early or maybe at the later stages, and if you exhaust your TKI options, so in a post-transplant patient, how should we proceed? So like immunotherapy has certain kind of limitations. So,
Yes.
so what should we do at that point of time?
So
Yeah.
I think before going for the systemic agents, best results that we have seen is with local ablative therapy. Local ablative therapy, especially microwave, they are safe and very effective. And combining them with tyrosine kinase inhibitors or checkpoint inhibitors, although I would, as Dr. Madhumita said, that checkpoint inhibitors have their own problems with regards to their interaction with the immunosuppressants and higher incidence of rejection. But TKIs are very safe, and combining them with these local ablative therapies has given a new hope for these patients. Like 2-3 years we have seen, there is no large scale data for this till now, but yes, they are being tried with good results. And we have even done TACE in post-transplant setting without any risk of graft. There have been multiple references. But yes, they should always be combined with any of these agents, whichever you are comfortable or a patient is comfortable. We are comfortable with these.
Dr. Shalin, can I one comment?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
I think that we have to be a little circumspect about recurrence in HCC. The commonest cause of death in a cirrhotic with HCC is liver failure. So basically, as we've discussed, we've actually treated 2 diseases, the HCC as well as the liver.
Yeah.
So if you have in any other oncological setting, as Dr. Shefali would know, I think overall survival is basically what matters rather than disease-free survival. So remember that even if we are in the situation where we have a disease recurrence, we are dealing with the disease recurrence in the context of a fully functioning liver. So basically, our treatment options actually increase substantially. So even if we have a recurrence in a patient who has these outcomes, or rather have these, we have a whole armamentarium of things that can be deployed in order to treat it, which we would not in a cirrhotic patient.
Yeah, that is what I just mentioned, that we have multiple options available to us post-transplant. But yes, we should not be very gung-ho also about transplanting these patients. Everything has to be taken care of.
I absolutely. But
it's a very big undertaking.
Yeah.
And,
I think our thinking also has changed from DFS to OS, and also understanding that even a patient with recurrence, as Dr. Shalin has very clearly said, can look to 2 or 3 years survival advantage. With the therapies that we have at this time.
Right. Right. I completely agree with you, sir. So because I mean, with the recurrence and having the limitations of not using a checkpoint inhibitors, which have actually revolutionized the treatment in the palliative setting. So the limitations are certainly there. So I completely agree with you to choose to pick and choose very wisely is the way to go forward, because the patient and the family are looking towards the cure. OS is the goal rather than a DFS in such a modality of treatment. So I think we should go ahead with the very selective criteria in those situations. So let me check the chat box, sir, if there are any questions which are unanswered still. Yeah, so there is a question, sir. Dr. Taneja has asked, so decompensated cirrhosis with small HCC, BCLC, D, will you transplant or not? So, sir, you can take this question.
Yeah, what is the question? Sorry, I missed on that.
Yeah, so the question is, decompensated cirrhosis with small HCC, BCLC, D, will you transplant or not?
See, BCLC D means that the performance status is not very good for this patient. Obviously, this poor performance status is an absolute contraindication by the BCLC staging. But over the years, it has been seen that in the LDLT settings and even in the DDLT settings, BCLC is a very restrictive kind of classification system. You are excluding the benefit of curative modalities to most of these patients if you stick to BCLC. So I would like to evaluate this patient. If he has any reasonable performance status and we are on the basis of our experience, we can say that this patient can tolerate a transplant, we should definitely go for transplant for the simple reason that his risk of dying from HCC is much less compared to his risk of dying from the decompensated liver disease. So even if he didn't have an HCC, even then this patient merited a transplant, but obviously we have to see his performance status. And when we talk about this performance status thing, this is again become a very subjective thing. What we at Max are seeing patients, most of these patients are coming at the very end of their liver failure cycle. Most of them, these patients are in renal failure, deeply jaundiced with multiple episodes of encephalopathy. And non-ambulatory. So we are offering transplants to these patients and have had very good results. So I would say that that D category has to be again subcategorized, and only the sickest of the sickest should be refrained from offering a transplant. Otherwise, transplant is a very good option for these patients.
Right, sir. So there is one more question. So Dr. Asthana, sir, you can take it. Technically apart, most of the patients in Northeast India with HCC happens to be poor, for which LDLT is out of option for them. So what do you suggest we do about them? So this is question by Dr. Aribam.
I mean, I think it goes back to the first point about access, availability, and local expertise, because it's very difficult to come up with a single answer for everything. And even as Dr. Shaleen has, you would have seen the differences between our center, which has got some DDLT, LDLT versus Delhi, which is almost completely LDLT, are also there actually. So regarding the question of finance, it is sadly a universal problem. It's not just a Northeastern problem. We at our center have a fairly good experience with raising funding for appropriate patients with CSR funding as well as with crowdfunding. And that's something that we can do at our level to try to raise it. There are larger efforts afoot through the National Health Authority to create some sort of package for liver transplantation, which would then be covered by Ayushman Bharat. So I think that this is a slightly separate question regarding lack of access due to a lack of funding. Again, there are local efforts that can be done, like our own, which has CSR, and there can be national efforts which will probably be in place in the next 3 or 4 years. But clearly, all these patients, Dr. Sharma, should be selected based on their potential for compliance. Because certainly we have found that patients who are too poor to even afford ongoing therapy or non-compliant would perhaps not be good candidates for selection for this. So I think that while patients can be selected and patients can be supported, even with existing mechanisms, the selection criteria for these should prioritize compliance, because otherwise the entire outcome of the exercise is not very useful.
Right, sir. So next question, Dr. Madhumita, if you can take over, though I think it has been discussed earlier also. So what is the role of PIVKA in HCC, especially when AFP is normal?
So around 30% of patients are actually not having raised AFP. In such cases, the use of PIVKA would actually give some prognostic indication and should be used as a surrogate tumor markers. Actually, rather than, I mean, we have been reading about DCP and AFP lens L3 and lens naris type. But I think the future would actually hold towards personalized medicine in HCC. So we should be looking at a lot more about liquid biopsy and molecular diagnostics, which would actually help us guide which kind of, tyrosine kinase inhibitor therapy or whether lenvatinib would work better. For example, the ramucirumab trial had AFP more than 400 versus less than 400. So these things would come in the future. So I would suggest that, I mean, if AFP is not elevated, then one can try the PIVKA, but it's not available in routine practice and we are not doing it unnecessarily.
Right, right. So I think all of the questions have been answered. So I thank you all very much for a very elaborate and very, very comprehensive session at the outset again, and answering all of our questions patiently. Thank you so much. And the next session will be focusing on the systemic treatments in HCC, all the bridgeovers again, the immunotherapies, the VEGF inhibitors, EGFR inhibitors, everything. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kripali.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Right, sir. Thank you.